There we go. Nope, that's not working. Good enough. Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome to my next review. And I'm just going to kick things right off the bat. Today, I will be reviewing the 1990 sequel to the 1987 masterpiece, Robocop 2, directed by Irvin Kershner. Same guy who directed Empire Strikes Back. Fun fact. So, and unfortunately, I will not be having a guest with me today. I wanted to have Shawnee Boy join me for this, but he just wasn't able to join. And plus, I do have some plans for this channel that I want to have come to fruition pretty soon. So, I'm going to finish off the Robocop trilogy by myself and then move on to another thing. So, yes, indeed. Robocop 2 released in 1990. So, of course, the first Robocop was a massive success. And Orion Pictures immediately wanted to follow it up with the sequel. Took 3 years, but still, we got one. The film was released June 22nd, 1990. To mixed reviews and minor box office success. It didn't make nearly as much money as the first film did, making only $45 million against a $25 to $30 million budget. And many people believe that the movie did suffer greatly due to the fact that Paul Verhoeven did not return to direct. And overall, it wasn't as highly praised as the first Robocop film was. Though the film does still have a cult following, and it does have some fans saying that it's still a good movie. And it also, as I said in the first Robocop review, it received attention in 2013 from news media due to its plot predicting the city of Detroit filing for bankruptcy in the future. The film was nominated for 3 Saturn Awards, including Best Science Fiction Film, Best Performance by a Younger Actor, and for Best Special Effects for Phil Tippett, Rob Bottin, and Peter Curran. My personal history with Robocop 2, this was technically the first of the series that I ever saw. I remember I saw this on TV once when I was on vacation with my family, and even though it was the TV edited version, I was just totally blown away by what I was seeing. I thought that it was one of the coolest movies that I'd ever seen in my life. So, a couple of years later, I went out with my mom to a flea market that was out in Portland. And hang on one second. And I came across the VHS tape of Robocop 2, so I bought it. And I must have watched, over the course of one summer, I must have watched this movie easily 100 times. Probably drove my mom up the wall by the time it was over. But I've seen this movie a butt-fuck-ass ton of times. And at one point, I did consider this to be my favorite in the series. That's not the case, unfortunately. I do have to say the first one is my favorite, but in the overall general scope of things, I definitely do think Robocop 2 is still an essential watching if you are a diehard Robocop fan. You can write off Robocop 3. You can write off the Robocop TV show if you've somehow been able to see it. Prime Directives. You can write off the rest of the Robocop franchise. But aside from the first movie, if you are a Robocop fan, I do still recommend you do check out Robocop 2. I think Robocop 2 is one of the most underrated movie sequels of all time. The film isn't perfect, unfortunately, but I think Robocop 2 does have a lot more things going for it than a lot of people says it does. So with all that being said, let's jump right into the plot of Robocop 2. In the near future, Detroit is on the verge of bankruptcy after failing to pay off its debts to OCP, Omni Consumer Products. The OCP chairman, once again played by Dan O'Herlihy, I think it's Herlihy. I don't know how to pronounce his name. He intends to have the city default on its debt and then foreclose on all of its public property, effectively completely taking over its government and allowing for a radical urban redevelopment plan. Again, which sounds so illegal, but whatever. To rally public opinion behind the project, OCP sparks an increase in street crime by terminating the privatized Detroit Police Department's pension plans, as well as cutting salaries, triggering a massive police strike. Again, this sounds incredibly illegal. Robocop remains on duty, however, with his partner, Ann Lewis. They raid a manufacturing plant of Nuke, a new designer drug that plagues Detroit. Although we never are actually told what this drug does to you when you take it. For all we know, it could just be as harmless as weed or shrooms. But we don't know. We're never told. The leader of this, pretty much, it's almost like a cult, Kane and his adolescent accomplice Hobb escape in the process, played by Tom Noonan and Gabriel Damon, respectively. Robocop has flashbacks to his previous life as Alex Murphy and has begun watching his wife and son outside their home. Still grieving over the death of her husband, his wife brings litigation against OCP, complaining of harassment. Actually, hang on one second here. Okay. After she is dressed down by his handlers, Robocop tells his wife that Murphy is dead. OCP struggles to develop a new Robocop 2 project, a police android intended for mass production to replace the striking police force, which is fitted with the brains of dead police officers like Robocop 1. However, these cops keep committing suicide upon activation, realizing that they are now cyborgs. Psychologist Dr. Juliet Fax convinces the chairman to let her control the project, this time using a criminal with a desire for power and immortality instead of police officers. God, sounds like such a bad idea. Kane, who is the leader of the Nuke cult, a drug kingpin with them, basically a god complex, following who is addicted to Nuke, fears losing his grip in the wake of the Delta City project and uses corrupt police officer Duffy to undermine OCP and Robocop's enforcement efforts. Robocop tracks down Duffy and beats the location of Kane's hideout out of him by smashing his face into a bunch of arcade machines. He confronts Kane's gang at an abandoned construction site, River Rouge, the old sludge plant. But he walks into a trap and is overwhelmed and dismantled. Robocop's pieces are dumped in front of his precinct, and Kane has Duffy vivisected for revealing their location and forces Hobb to watch, which is one of the probably most uncomfortable scenes in the film, probably the most uncomfortable. Robocop is repaired, but Fax reprograms him with hundreds of confusing new directives at the insistence of the OCP board of directors, severely impeding his ability to perform his duties. This reprogrammed Robocop segment is easily the worst part of the film. Robocop eventually clears these out by shocking himself with a high-voltage transformer and rebooting his system, now reverting his programming back to default directives 1, 2, and 3 form. Murphy motivates the striking officers to aid him in raiding Kane's hideout, and as Kane tries to escape, Robocop wounds and apprehends him. Hobb escapes and takes control of Kane's drug empire, and believing she can control Kane via his nuke addiction, Fax selects him for the Robocop 2 project and disconnects his life support. Surgeons place his brain into a heavily armed robotic body and reactivate him. After failing to pay the city's debts via voluntary fundraising, the mayor is contacted by Hobb, who offers to retire the city's entire debt in exchange for a hands-off policy towards Nuke, thereby nullifying OCP's scheme and preventing Delta City's construction. Threatened by this move, OCP sends Kane to the meeting, where he responds by slaughtering everybody but the mayor, who manages to escape. Robocop arrives to find a wounded Hobb, who identifies the attacker as Kane before dying. The chairman presents an unveiling ceremony for both Kane and Delta City, their redevelopment plan, as well as their entire scheme of basically fucking over the entire city. When he presents a canister of nuke, Kane's uncontrollable addiction causes him to attack the crowd. Robocop arrives and fights Kane, and their battle extends to the street. This is probably my favorite part of the film. Robocop uncovers the nuke canister, and Lewis uses it to distract Kane, which leads Robocop leaping onto his back, shooting through his armor and ripping out Kane's brain and destroying it, which ends Kane's rampage. The chairman and Johnson decide to scapegoat Fax to free OCP. As Lewis complains that OCP is escaping accountability once again, Robocop says, "Patience, Lewis. We're only human," thus ending the film. So how about this plot? Well, as a direct continuation of the original Robocop story, I think this movie actually does a very good job of doing that. In one scene that I watched on YouTube, I saw a comment saying that Robocop 2's biggest problem is that it's not Terminator 2. And I don't entirely agree with this. I can kind of see where he's saying. Much in the same way that Terminator 2 is an excellent continuation of the Terminator lore, so is Robocop 2 an excellent continuation of Robocop lore. It thankfully does have a lot of returning cast members. Actually, it has almost all of them. Actually, no, it does have all of them. It still looks very much the same as the first film, obviously with a higher budget, but I'll get to that. It expands the lore. It builds its world a lot more. It continues some of the themes from the first film, which also does help that this movie stay consistent with the first film. And overall, it takes everything that most of what was great about the first Robocop movie, and thankfully with a much larger budget, expands upon it and makes it feel bigger. This is why I say if a sequel is going to be great, it has to take everything that its predecessor did and just bump it up to 11. Blade 2 does this. Terminator 2 does this. Jurassic Park 2 almost does this, and Robocop 2 almost does this. So that's all I have to say about that. So let's just jump right into the pros and cons of Robocop 2. Pro number one is that there's fantastic action scenes in this film. Thankfully, like I said, this movie greatly benefits from a larger budget. The first movie had a budget of $13 million, which, while that movie didn't necessarily look cheap, it did, in some cases, feel slightly restricted by its low-ish budget. However, with this movie, with a $25 to $30 million budget, Irvin Kershner obviously just went absolutely nuts with making this movie look bigger and better and more polished than the first film. And I think it succeeds absolutely 100% because of it. The action scenes are very well edited. They're very well choreographed. There's lots of bullets, bombs, blood splattering everywhere, explosions left and right. There's actually quite a few explosions in this film. There's a lot better special effects. Overall, the action scenes are extremely entertaining, and there's also lots of them too. There's the initial gun store explosion and shootout. There's the drug raid. There's the arcade action scene. There's Robocop being torn apart. There's the second drug raid. Kane slaughtering his cult. And then the final Robocop versus Robocop 2 fight, which is 10 to 12 minutes long. So this movie has plenty of action scenes in them. If you want to watch this movie just for its action scenes, this movie will absolutely wet your whistle very well. Pro number 2 is the gore. I don't think this movie is quite as violent as the first movie, but it definitely is a lot of violence in this film. And the gore, because the overlying theme of this movie is that it definitely does benefit from having a larger budget. The squibs just splatter blood when everyone is shot. They just spray blood all over the place. The vivisection scene, even though it's uncomfortable to watch, the effects done on that are pretty convincing. Like, it actually looks like this dude was being sliced open. And the most notable scene with Gore is when Kane is taken off life support. The ER doctors have to go in and pretty much saw and drill his skull open in order to extract his brain. We don't necessarily see his skull being drilled into, but we hear the sound effects, and we do see some blood splattering everywhere. The sound effects are absolute, like they set my teeth on edge, and they like send shivers up my spine every time I hear them, because it's loud, sharp crunching with loud, intense drilling. That's the best way I can describe it. And then eventually, when they get the skull to rip off, it's like this sharp cracking sound. And then they have to go in and take with tweezers in order to extract Kane's brain and spinal cord. And you hear these really wet, sloshy, sucking sound effects. And it's just, ugh, it almost makes me gag. Whoever the sound designer for this movie, whoever they were, they did an excellent job with the sound effects. And then afterwards, this is a little cheesy, but it still is kind of gross. We see Kane's brain, eyeballs, and spinal cord inside a water tank. And then we get to see through Kane's eyes, doctors holding his decapitated head with their gloves and uniforms being slathered in blood. It's pretty nasty. So top-notch gore effects. Pro number 3 is, this is kind of minor, but I just do want to say I think this movie has really good production value. Because once again, like I said, this movie greatly benefits from a larger budget. Again, not to say that the first movie didn't look bad. Its low-ish budget helped the movie look dark and gritty and gross. This movie still does look dark and gritty, but it still does look a lot more polished. The streets are cleaner, but they still look gross. Everywhere just has this rundown, decrepit look to it, but it still looks a little bit more polished. The Robocop suit is kind of a mixed bag, but when it looks good, it looks amazing. I'll get to that later. The action scenes are much more well edited. There's a bigger budget to those. And there's also more action scenes, like I said. The effects on Robocop 2 are top-notch. I'll get to that in a minute. The sets are larger. The camera shots are wider and bigger. This movie just feels like it's a much larger production than its predecessor. And there's also, I feel like there's a lot of enthusiasm along with that heightened budget. There's a lot more enthusiasm into making this movie look as good as it does. And for me, at least, that translates and like seeps into me as well. Like when I watch Robocop 2, I feel like I'm getting swept up with everyone's enthusiasm with this movie. It's just a shame this movie didn't do nearly as well. But whatever. So the production value was great. Pro number 4 is the special effects. May as well get to them. The Robocop suit, like I said, when it looks good, because there is a side of the Robocop suit that's not necessarily a huge flaw, but it is something I want to talk about. But when it looks good, it looks really, really good. Robocop has a bit of a different paint scheme in this film, where in the first movie, he was kind of like a dull, metallic, silverish blue. Here, he's a much more brighter shade of blue. He's almost as blue as my shirt. There's some green and purplish colors kind of sleeked over the blue. But Robocop is sporting a much bluer color in this movie, and I think he actually looks a little bit better than he did in the first movie. It also makes the black parts of his suit pop out that much more. I'm not sure if they did make a different suit, or actually, no, I know for a fact they did because of Oliver Harper, but they did use a different suit, and it looks pretty much the same as the previous suit. Except it looks a lot shinier. Obviously, it also, of course, has the blue color scheme, but it still looks pretty much the same. I feel like they may have modified it slightly to give Peter Weller an easier time moving around, but his performance as Robocop is not different at all. He still moves the same. He looks like he just didn't even have any. He didn't have 3 years for his Robocop skills to atrophy. He just looks like he stepped right off Robocop 1 and then stepped right into Robocop 2, because his mannerisms as Robocop is still top notch. The explosions look really good. I think there's 3 or 4 in this movie that aren't or there's one of them that's stop motion, but there's 3 or 4 explosions in this movie that do look really good. And that leads me to stop motion. So Robocop 2 himself, I'm not going to talk about the robot itself. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the effects utilized on Robocop 2 is a hybrid of practical and stop motion, with a majority of them being stop motion. There's some props here and there for the characters to interact with Robocop 2. There's one of Robocop's robotic hands. There's a Robocop puppet of his head and a little bit of his shoulders. I think there is one with one of his legs, and there's one of them with one of his chest pieces. But for the most part, Robocop 2 is executed via stop motion animation. Now, by 1990, stop motion animation was almost extinct, unfortunately. But I feel like this movie may have been the last hurrah for stop motion to exit the scenery. At least as a primary form of effects. I do know stop motion was used for quite a bit in the early to mid 90s, but it was only used very sparingly, as I'll talk about tomorrow when I get to Robocop 3. But Robocop 2 is primarily executed with stop motion animation, and it looks utterly spectacular. It was done by Phil Tippett, who also did the stop motion animation for the first Robocop film for Ed 209. But this is where he truly gets his chance to shine with Robocop 2. Now, for those of you who don't know, Phil Tippett can be described as a modern-day Ray Harryhausen. Because after Ray Harryhausen died, of course, he was the big name in stop motion up until he retired. But then afterwards, it was pretty much Phil Tippett. Phil Tippett was also going to animate Jurassic Park if they were going to use stop motion animation. Of course, they didn't. And as I said with Jackie Boy in my original review, I don't think Jurassic Park would have worked nearly as well if they went with Phil Tippett's stop motion animation. But I do know also that Phil Tippett stuck around to consult the CG animation for that film. But this is truly, I believe, Phil Tippett's best work as a stop motion animator is Robocop 2. The puppet they use for RoboCop 2 is very well detailed. It's very intricate. It's very complicated. It's very complex, and it's animated beautifully. You totally buy this as being an actual robot walking around and not just a clay puppet. The stop motion is very seamless. There's no moment where it jitters or like it just doesn't work or it looks well. Obviously, it does look fake, but there's no moment where it looks bad. It's animated very smoothly and very seamlessly, and you can obviously tell that Phil Tippett had a lot of time to work with this thing and make it look as good as possible, and it never once looks bad. I'd say this is probably the most flawless stop motion animation I've ever seen in my life. Yes, even more than King Kong 33, even more than Mighty Joe Young, and even more than anything that Ray Harryhausen ever did. Or hell, anything that Phil Tippett even did. So props to him. So overall, the special effects for RoboCop 2, 99% of the time, they are good. The only thing that's bad is some parts of the RoboCop suit, which I'll get to when I get to the cons. But also there's some green screen and blue screen effects that don't look all that well. But thankfully, they're not that common. And when you do see them, they're on screen for only a few seconds at a time. So you could just take that for what it is. Pro number, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the pace of the film is only decent. It's not great, and it's not like the first film, but this movie does have a decent pace. The first act and the third act are paced beautifully. It's the second act that I have a major issue with. I'll get to that when I get to the cons, but when this pacing is good, it's perfect. It moves along at a very smooth and cinematic pace. It keeps you gripped and engaged when it needs to be, and it thrills you and entertains you when it needs to be. The pacing is imbalanced, unfortunately, but when it's good, it's really, really good. Pro number 6 is RoboCop 2 himself. Now, I don't think they really should have called this thing RoboCop 2. I just feel like they should have made this maybe like another Ed 209 type thing. But as a design, as a combat robot, RoboCop 2 is fucking awesome. I definitely do like that it is much more combat oriented in mind because this thing has a ton of weapons. Has a Gatling gun on one arm that seemingly has infinite ammo because whenever RoboCop 2 is on screen, half of the soundtrack is that goddamn Gatling gun going off. And this is seemingly his primary weapon is this Gatling gun. It also has a battering ram right below this Gatling gun. And RoboCop 2 still does have a hand underneath his battering ram and Gatling gun, but that's most of his left arm. He has another arm, of course, which has 3 fingers, and this is mainly just used to lift stuff and throw stuff, of course. He has another smaller arm, which is more like a pincer that I'm guessing is used to manipulate smaller objects. He has an arc welder right below his Gatling gun arm. And in one shoulder, he has like a riot cannon, which gets destroyed after only 3 shots, but whatever. And of course, this thing has a pretty much completely bulletproof chassis, except for some weaker spots behind the head. RoboCop 2, in terms of a giant robot that can go around and fuck shit up, definitely is one badass motherfucker. Now, it's kind of a shame that RoboCop 2 is seemingly his only appearance is in this movie. I'm not sure if he's in any other RoboCop comics. I actually wouldn't be surprised if he's in at least one. But RoboCop 2 as a giant robot is pretty damn awesome and is a very good foe for RoboCop to take on. I probably should also mention, so I'll just make this another pro. Hang on. One, two, three, four, 5, 6, 7, 8. So pro number 7 is Robocop himself. At least I think that's number 7. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, pro number 7 is once again Robocop himself. Well, his characterization is unfortunately not as good as the first movie. I'll get to that when I get to the cons. Robocop, just simply as a badass motherfucker, is even better than the first movie. His detective skills are expanded upon just a little bit more. Like you see him stake out Hobb in the arcade scene, and he uses his vision and auditory systems to actually solve a crime. You also see that when he's out and about on patrol, he does have a little bit of a sense of humor. Like when he shows up at the very beginning of the movie and he's gunning down these dudes who are robbing a gun store. He just goes, "Peace, officer. Think it over, creep," and then guns down one motherfucker. So he walks into their car and picks up a thing of nuke. He walks over and crushes it in his hand, saying, "Where is this made?" And when the guy refuses to play ball, he just grabs him by his nose and lifts him up. "Where is it made?" And then when he finally gives, he just like, "Fuck out of here." I could literally name off every single awesome thing that Robocop does in this movie. When he walks up to the drugstore, or not drugstore, the drug factory, instead of just trying to get the guy to open the door to the place, he knocks on it, and when the guy opens the slider, just punches right through the door and knocks him out. When two dudes walk into a freezer, he locks them in there and just walks away. Let's see. I literally could. Almost everything that Robocop does in this movie is awesome. In order to give chase against Kane when he's... What are you distracting me for, huh? You did not. What'd you get?
Lift up, I will tell you. Same thing as last night. Except for I changed mine a little bit. I got you the same thing as last night. It was only 21. It was less. Last night was 25, and now it's 21. Because I got $0. Anyways, not there. Tell me when we get a person.
You're a great wife. I ain't gonna say no to Uber Eats and Taco Bell. Anyway, so where was I? And those two. Anyway, I totally lost track of what I was talking about. Oh, in order to chase after Kane when he runs off in a truck after they start raiding his drug lair, Robocop just simply snags a motorcycle and knocks some dude off and gives chase. To take out Kane, smashes right into the vehicle and like just hurls himself at Kane. To combat Robocop 2, he shows up knowing that it's Kane with his freaking own Cobra assault cannon and just says, "Kane, let's step outside." He also used a lot more ingenuity to quickly escape Robocop 2. He grabs onto a elevator cable, shoots through it, zips him away, and also causes Robocop 2 to fall. So Robocop 2 definitely has improved a lot in terms of being a badass motherfucker, and also with his sense of humor. And also you still see little bits of compassion here and there. In the beginning, when he walks into the drug lab, he sees a little baby being held, and the first thing he does is like rub its head, shut off the music, and that music that's playing to cover over the sound, I'm guessing. But when a thug takes the baby and threatens to shoot it just to let himself get away, points his gun away, but then he uses his targeting system to detect a trajectory to fire off a bullet and ricochet it off a freezer door. And so he does. Lewis, stand down. Boom! Bonk! And the first thing that Lewis does, too, is just grab the baby and protect it from harm. So yeah, Robocop is still a badass motherfucker in terms of just taking down bad guys and fucking them up left and right. So that's all, of course, always fun to watch. And finally, pro number 8 is the ending. This movie's ending for the last 15 minutes or so is just nonstop action. Robocop fighting Robocop 2, the police showing up, trying to take down Robocop 2 and just getting mowed down left and right. The various stages of Robocop fighting Robocop 2, tries to shoot him out, then they slug it out with their fists, and then finally Robocop 2 finally uses ingenuity and his wits, and of course tears open his skull and takes out his brain and smashes it. It's a very entertaining finale to a series of very entertaining action scenes. And in terms of a great, thrilling finale, this movie is just top notch. So with all these good things to say about this movie, unfortunately, there are quite a few problems with this movie. Con number 1 is I want to talk about the Robocop suit. I don't know if they made this movie's suit to be cheaper than the previous movie, or if it would cost roughly the same, but they just didn't shoot it nearly as well. But I noticed there's a lot of like little flaws here and there with the Robocop suit. The crotch piece on the Robocop suit likes to flap around and move quite a bit more than it did in the first movie. There's a lot more seams that you can see in this movie's suit as well. Like you can see clearly Peter Weller's neck in the scuba suit lining, and whenever Robocop turns his head a lot more. Whenever you okay?
That's for you.
Robocop lifts up his arms. Oh, thank you, honey. You can see clearly the black parts of his arms are pretty much just like gloves, and you can see between where the glove ends and where the forearm begins, and you can see the scuba suit lining underneath. Also, there's a scene where Robocop is twisting his wrist, and you can tell that the glove is made out of rubber, and you can see clearly the crease in the rubber as he's twisting his wrist and he knocks on the door. And also, there's another scene toward the end where, unfortunately, it has Aaron's suit from Attack on Titan syndrome, where Robocop is grabbing onto a grate, and you can tell that the Robocop suit's fingers are like half an inch longer than Peter Weller's actual fingers, because when he grabs onto something, his fingertips crease, and it's so noticeable to me. And it drives me insane. So again, I don't know if this movie's suit was cheaper than the previous movie, or if they just didn't shoot it very well. But this movie's suit, in some areas, just drives me absolutely insane because it just kind of seems lazily shot. Con number 2 is, unfortunately, a lot of the characters, aside from Robocop, they just aren't that interesting. Lewis barely has anything to do in this movie. She has a couple moments where she shines. Obviously, at the beginning, she, the 2 criminals that Robocop caught in that freezer, she just opens the door, takes one out easily, and shoots the other. And then she immediately rescues the baby after the dude's shot. But another moment where she shines is instead of trying to grab onto Robocop as he's shocking himself to rid him of his bullshit directives, she instead takes a plank of wood and just smashes him away from the conduit, which is a good thing to do, or not conduit, from the generator, because wood does not conduct electricity. So if you were to try to knock somebody away from something as they're being electrocuted, you either grab a pair of rubber gloves, because rubber also does not conduct electricity, or you grab a plank of wood and you just try to knock them away. Obviously, that one's going to hurt more, but he's made of metal, so who cares? And the only other notable moment is at the very end where Lewis decides to use a urban pacification vehicle as a battering ram to subdue Robocop 2 and smash him into a wall. Other than that, Lewis does jack shit in this movie, and it's kind of disappointing because this leads me into con number 3. It's that Robocop's character development as is him regaining his identity and regaining some of his humanity, that seems to have just been kind of forgotten about with this movie. Like at the end of the film, Robocop was speaking in Murphy's normal voice and tone. He wasn't speaking like the monotone robot like he was for a majority of the film. That's how he speaks in this movie. Is he speaks as a monotonous robot. And it's a little disappointing because it seems like they did this with every single other installment of the Robocop series, and they never once remembered, oh yeah, he speaks normally because he knows who he is now. I thought he went through this in the first movie. I thought a big point of the first movie was so that he could regain his identity and figure out who he was. And now it just feels like they hit the reset button, but now they have absolutely no desire to actually fulfill on that promise of him regaining his identity. They just want to keep him as badass, walking, talking giant robot. That can work, but it still is a little disappointing when he doesn't have any human side to him to make you kind of relate to him. So that's a problem. Let's see. Con number 4 is the villains in this movie. I feel like in terms of the villains, this movie sorta has a little bit of Sinister 2 syndrome, where the movie wants to focus on both OCP being the main villains, but also with Kane and his cult being the villains. Now, it does work in some places, but mostly in the first act, the movie establishes that both OCP and Kane are the villains of this movie. And I kind of feel like they should have started out with Kane being the established villain and then slowly showcase that OCP is becoming a lot more scumbaggish as the movie goes on. But they both establish at the very beginning that these are the villains and somehow they're working together, but they're also not working together. And it just kind of gets a little bit out of control by the end of the movie. I kind of feel like at the end of the movie, they should have just focused on Kane being the villain. Like they should have not established that OCP is the one that is controlling Kane. Or, oh God, that doesn't make sense either. Like they should have had a scene where Robocop 2 also has the same directives as Robocop 1, but much quicker than Robocop 1. He breaks through his directives and he becomes sentient and self-aware. Sounds a little bit like Terminator, yes, but still, I think it would have worked much better that way. Time says 6:20, honey. And your phone is at 9%. Nope. So the villains here just do feel a little bit inconsistent. My main issue with OCP as well is that why make the old man seemingly the progenitor of all of these evil schemes? Because, well, granted, the old man didn't really come off as being the most moral person on the planet, but, oh, we got a driver. He still did seem somewhat concerned for Detroit's fate, and he wasn't just a complete money-hungry, scheming bureaucrat. He's exactly that in this movie. All he's concerned about is money and the highest profit margin available. And I feel like that's, again, it's like the writers were taking all the characters one step back instead of 2 steps back with Robocop, but whatever. They should have simply focused on Fax being the evil one in OCP and not Johnson or the old man being villainous as well. Now, granted, they could have showcased that OCP's methods of undermining Detroit were still not exactly morally conscious, but they still were about bettering Detroit and making the future brighter for the human race. Whereas now they're just an evil corporation, one step below the umbrella corporation. So I feel like they should have focused on Fax being the evil one, and at the very end, absolutely using her as the scapegoat is the best interest for the old man and Johnson, if that makes any sense. But my point is, they should have focused on Fax being the evil OCP employee and not having all of OCP just be outright evil. I feel like that was just jumping the shark a little bit too much. And they could have saved for OCP finally being the umbrella corporation for Robocop 3. But no. Let's see. Con number 5 is the music score. Now, the music score was not the same as the first movie. The music was done by Leonard Rosenman. This movie's music is ass. I do not like this movie's music score whatsoever. When it's generic action movie music, that works just fine. But when it's the new supposed Robocop theme, it's terrible. It is absolutely terrible. It's basically a choir of chicks triumphantly and heroically screaming, Robocop! And it's so cheesy, and it's so bad. It is so cringy and corny and just garbage. And never once does this movie have the classic dun 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 Robocop theme. It's so disappointing. Excuse me. Not much to say about that other than the music for this movie I think is garbage. Avery is on his way, honey. 6:17 is when he'll be here. I'm almost done here anyway, though. I'm almost done here. And then finally, the last con that I have is the second act of this movie, specifically the reprogrammed Robocop scene where he's going around being all happy and hunky-dory and being, don't shoot people, don't rob people, don't start forest fires. I'm like a robotic version of Smokey the Bear. Oh, God, it's so fucking stupid and it's so cringy. It's so bad and it's just facepalm inducing. It's just pain. Why? If you wanted it to have a bit more of a comedic touch, that's fine. But to go PG rated Robocop is worse than PG-13 rated Robocop. Oh, wait a minute. The entire reprogrammed Robocop scene in the second act of the film, it's just bad. And it's easily the worst part of the film, in my opinion. And it's the biggest thing that holds this movie back for me. So I'm just going to wrap this review up here. Overall, Robocop 2, it is a good sequel. I do think it is a good sequel. It's got a lot of good things going for it. It's got great effects. It's got a bigger budget, great action scenes. And overall, it's a great continuation of its predecessor. However, the stupid reprogrammed Robocop segments, the inconsistent villains, and the lack of the Robocop theme do hold this movie quite a bit for me. I wanted to give this movie a perfect 10 when I first thought about reviewing this movie, but I actually watched this movie 3 times in preparation for this review. So I cannot in good conscience give this a perfect 10. I wanted to, and I wanted to say this was my favorite for a while, but I unfortunately cannot do that. So I will be giving this movie a 7.5 out of 10. I do think this is a good movie. Like I keep saying, if you're a giant Robocop fan, you should definitely check this movie out. It is entertaining. It's a lot of fun to watch. And if you want to just watch a movie that's 2 hours long, which that's one thing I also want to say too, this movie's longer than the first film. And I feel like it's best when sequels are longer than their predecessors. That's when they're at their best. But if you want to just watch 2 hours of RoboCop going around fucking shit up, this movie's right up your alley. So a 7.5 out of 10. It's a good movie. It's a good sequel, but it's got quite a few problems that do hold it back from being a perfect sequel. So thank you very much for watching, and look forward to tomorrow as I review the redheaded stepchild of the series, RoboCop 3. Post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. Share this video with your friends. And as always, I will see you guys in the next video.